Right, I'll let you now. Let me make you host now. Sorry.
Sorry.
There we go. Do you want to make host, George Richards? Yes.
Okay.
Okay, you got it?
I'll go back and share screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Should go large, but it's not going large.
You need just to view slideshow, don't you, I would imagine?
Yeah, it won't let me do it.
Oh, it won't.
That's weird. Do that.
I think you had it before, actually.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
We got view slideshow there.
Let me go down the bottom. I'll try that one instead. It's got two ways of doing it.
Yeah.
It's not changing it.
Right.
That's odd. No, won't let me do it. That's very weird.
Yeah.
Oh well, we'll do it in outline view.
Okay, all right. And apologies to everyone. It's just turned 2 o'clock. And I just want to welcome everyone to the second event of our contribution to Net Zero Week, which is a new event that we're very proud and to be privileged to be partnering. We've got a range of events on this week. I would like to just apologise. Things are a little bit hit and miss at the minute because my computer literally went down, failed me literally 3 minutes before the session was due to start. So I've just had to borrow someone else's laptop, and like any new laptop, not particularly familiar with everything. So it did just take me a little while to get used to it. And we've also got a slight issue with the presentation, but hopefully you'll get the content of the presentation, which I think is the important aspect of any presentation. And really just wanted to say I'm Mervyn Pilley. I'm the Director of ESTA, Energy Services Technology Association. We're a trade association based in the UK, and about 35 years we've been, our members have been providing a wide range of energy efficiency solutions to a wide range of sectors and a wide range of primarily non-domestic commercial organisations. We do strongly believe that energy efficiency is a very important part of everyone's net zero journey. Probably, to be fair, the start of everyone's net zero journey, and most of our events this week are built around that underlying premise that energy efficiency has an important role to play. I should have had an opening slide to just back up this little bit of introduction, but unfortunately that's on the other laptop, so I'm going to have to extricate that and hopefully manage to get my old laptop back up and running in time for the events tomorrow. So apologies for the slight challenging start. But I'd like to welcome George Richards, who's a director of JRP Solutions, a long-standing ESTA member. And I'm very happy to invite George to share some, I think, quite interesting insights this afternoon into net zero and some of the perhaps more slightly unusual or certainly things that you may or may not have thought about as part of your journey to net zero. So yes, happy to. What I'd suggest is if you can put any questions you have into the chat, please, chat box, and I will keep an eye on the chat box while George is presenting. Probably try and do the questions at the end. I think that would probably be preferable for you, George, as well.
That's fine. Yeah, whichever suits.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on the chat box as we go along, and then at the end we'll have a Q&A session. Hopefully, we'll be able to answer the questions at the end. So on that basis, George, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mervyn. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so the primary focus of this presentation is one that we gave a couple of months ago. We were talking about the green recovery now, but the theme is still very relevant to net zero. And indeed, when we had that discussion earlier in the year, we did talk about net zero and all of this in the context thereof. So I'll go through it, and whatever questions there are, park them till the end if you want, or post them in the chat. That's absolutely fine. Happy to answer any questions, and if there are any that I can't answer, then I'll be happy to take those away and revert back. So without further ado, so for those of you that don't know who JRP are, We've been around since 1999, and we're one of the UK's leading independent energy net zero and outsourcing specialists. We began our own transition towards net zero about 4 years ago, when we could see the changing landscape, and when particularly the financial sector were making the right noises and making quite bold statements, which has been further enhanced, if you like, by statements by people like Mark Carney, etc. So we saw that coming, and we basically geared ourselves up to help our clients and new clients achieve their own net zero targets. We are, as that third point says, we are uniquely practical and pragmatic. We've worked primarily in the industrial and commercial sectors with many different organisations for many years, and we always look at energy within its own context. And what I mean is within its own working environment. There are certain generic truths, I guess, when it comes to energy management. But I think the one thing that we always do is take an holistic view and a practical and pragmatic view. So it's about what will work in one environment doesn't necessarily work in another. And you have to take into account conflicting resources and priorities, etc., which I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted, but that's generally our approach. And it's one that we've taken through into our net zero work as well. And on that note, 2 years ago, we were having 1 or 2 conversations around net zero with clients. Now it's probably 80% of all our engagements are around net zero. It's very interesting because every client's journey is different. And I promised myself I wouldn't use that word journey because I personally hate it, but there you go. So yes, we've always helped organizations develop and implement practical strategies around energy management or outsourcing or whatever it might have been. And that work still remains at the core of our knowledge and experience and really fits in well with net zero. Similar approaches and processes. And I think it's also important that, it's not just us. We have a net zero network, which we established about 18 months ago, which is a network of individual specialists in areas that, we have limited knowledge in. So that might be around planning or biodiversity, etc. And so we bring them in on a project by project basis as and when they're needed. But I think the other important thing to say, which actually isn't on this slide as such, but we walk the walk as well. 9001 is obviously a quality management system. We had that in place in 2003. We've since become ISO 50001. We've applied to become a B Corp, and our approval is imminent. And we also have a net zero target ourselves of 2030. So we don't just talk about it, we do it as well. Here's a couple, a few nice quotes from clients that we shouldn't be shy of. As you can see, it's a diverse range of clients. There's just 3 I pulled out of a probably active client base, about 250 plus. We measure all of our interactions with our client base. So every time we do a piece of work, we do a customer satisfaction survey. We don't get all of them back as you'd expect, but our current rating is at 96%, I believe, which is pretty good for a services business. So talking about some typical white elephants, CHP, and why would I say that can be a white elephant? I'm not saying any of these are always white elephants, because clearly they're not. But I think where they're misapplied, where clients have been sold a bit of a pup because the groundwork hasn't been done, the long-term view hasn't been taken, then yes, they very much can be white elephants. Historically, I suppose, back in the days of the dash for gas, for those of us that are old enough to remember it, everyone went for CHP. And they did it because the spark gap encouraged them to do so. But in some cases, and there is still a legacy of oversized plant out there, because they didn't do, or in some cases at least, work wasn't done to reduce energy consumption, to improve energy management. And there you ended up with oversized plant, which then latterly didn't meet the quality index, etc., etc. There were other things that came along with that, which applies to any technologies around the supporting agreements. So that's another area in which we've helped our clients. So CHP very much can be, and in the context of net zero, you really do have to challenge the key drivers for considering CHP in the first place. The spark gap is attractive enough to gain people's interest in CHP. However, from a net zero perspective, it's very debatable, because you're continuing to burn fossil fuels, and with the decarbonisation of the grid, is CHP in the longer term the right thing to do? And that's up for debate. And it really does depend on the client and their individual drivers and their particular circumstances. There are circumstances where operationally, or because the local grid network can't provide them with sufficient energy, then there is little choice but for on-site generation. But CHP, again, might not be the answer. Biomass, there have been some really good biomass installations, but I think, again, unless you take an holistic view and tie up the commercial, environmental, operational considerations, these things can also become a white elephant. What I mean by that is there are a number of examples I could cite where that holistic approach wasn't taken. And in one instance, a large-scale biomass CHP plant was installed. And however, it wasn't online anywhere near as often or as much as was suggested by the installer. Because of a contractual naivety, there was no real guarantee of performance, either in terms of uptime, in terms of maintenance, in terms of plant efficiency. And as we pointed out when we looked at it, we said, well, equally, you don't have a secure supply of feedstock. So whilst you've got a capital write-down of, say, 10 years for the life of the project, if your supply of feedstock doubles in cost or has to come from the other end of the country or from outside the country, it blows the business case completely. So you need to tie all those ends up and make sure it stacks up. And different regions have different views of biomass. Whether it's appropriate to burn wood at all is again subject to debate and opinion. BMS systems, we've been in and into numerous client sites where they have BMS installed systems, but they've not been managed. They've basically been left to collect dust. They're not allowed to do their job. So you'll go in, as I'm sure lots of people on this call have been in, lots of people have been into sites where windows are open, air conditioning's on, or heating's on, windows open, or sometimes even air conditioning's on at the same time heating's on, which is crazy. We all know that. But quite simply, by taking a look at the system, optimizing it, allowing it to do its job and managing it, a good BMS system is worth its weight in gold. But as I say, unless they're managed properly and checked, they can be a white elephant. MMT systems, for me, it's always our starting point. Whenever we go to a site to engage a client for the first time, is we always ask about the quality and consistency of their data. Because if you have a hole in your data is more or less useless. And I remember, I think Dan Smith's on this call. I remember Dan and I, when Dan worked at JRP, I remember going into a food manufacturer and seeing a gas meter directly above a major energy using bit of kit. And it was covered in dust. It had an output on it, but no one had read the meter. It wasn't being read. So straight away, without even asking any more questions, you knew that there wasn't a focus on energy, because if there was, they would have picked it up and recognized that there was a big hole in their energy data and done something about it. And it wasn't. So without even having to do an in-depth energy audit, the indications were very, very clear. And as it transpired, we subsequently did an energy audit, and there was an opportunity to reduce energy consumption by about 24% on that site, which is crazy. And for a relatively low investment, so there's a whole myriad of things around behaviour change, processes, procedures, having a plan, targets, etc. So it's not just about the magic black box that sits in the corner and your problems are solved. Contractual conflict. So almost irrespective of the project, whether it's CHP, whether it's renewables, PPAs, EPCs, whatever it might be, if you don't understand the complexity of the contractual arrangements that sit behind that and have put in place the right performance measures, KPIs, etc., then, you know, we have been employed on scores and scores of occasions to review and put right errors in contracts in the past. And I can again cite all sorts of examples of that. So it shouldn't be undervalued or underestimated, and often is. And when we get involved, obviously, you know, we address the basic principles of those supporting agreements. We've worked with the likes of Diageo, etc., Vodafone, AstraZeneca, GSK, Toyota, Boots, to help them get that right. Part of that, an important part of that, is the measurement and verification of performance. So one thing to put a big piece of plant in, but another thing to make sure it's actually performing the way it's designed to work. And so we use IPMVP. I'm sure there's people on this webinar that are also qualified practitioners. And that just ensures that you have an agreed mechanism at the outset and the appropriate level of metering in place to allow you to accurately measure and verify the performance of any piece of kit. Why should you do that? Well, hopefully the answer is obvious, because one, it tells you whether you've got into bed with the right company, you've installed the right piece of kit, and that the contracts are actually working, it's performing the way it should do. And secondly, it helps you to understand which projects are worth repeating elsewhere, and also helps you when you next go to the FD asking for investment in something else, because you've already proven the worth of your investments. So a critical part of it, which is often overlooked or undervalued. And then looking at it in a net zero context, it's not good enough anymore, as I mentioned with CHP, purely to look at it from purely an energy perspective or a cost perspective. It's got to be looked in the round. As a country, we've signed up to achieve net zero by 2050. So that means that every organisation has to do at least that. And that means all GHGs, not just scope 1, scope 2, but scope 3 as well. We'll touch on that in a moment. But you've got to look at all of these projects and measures in the context of net zero. How is it going to positively contribute to your net zero goals? Is it going to reduce your GHGs, or is it actually just going to generate a bit of a cost case in the first instance, but then you'll live to regret it 5 or 10 years later? Because one thing's for sure, delivered energy is going to get more expensive, and the cost of carbon is going to get more expensive too. So all of these things should be looked at in the context of net zero. Yeah, we've talked about this. So, but there are other issues around it as well. We've got one particular client we're dealing with at the moment where the CHP engine itself, or engines, are managed, operated and maintained by one party, by a third party. It's owned by the client, operated and maintained by another, by a third party. And then the ancillary equipment is then subcontracted out to another third party. So you can imagine whenever there's an issue with the plant, and there have been lots of issues, and fingers are pointing it every which way, and it's sort of like being in the middle of a boxing match, which is going badly wrong for the referee. So these things do need to be thought about, and they do need to be understood and clearly laid out in good, transparent agreements and measured correctly. One thing you don't want to end up with is what's commonly known as stranded assets, i.e. that they're not meeting the main purpose. Yeah, biomass, again, I'll probably talk too much at the overview slide, but yeah, it's looking at biomass. One, ask what the key drivers are. Certainly look at it in the context of net zero, understand what the local view is of the local authorities or government regions with regards to burning certain types of feedstock, and then look at it in the round. One thing to assure yourselves that the kit is going to do what the OEM says it's going to do, but there's quite another to make sure that you've got your numbers right and you've got a secure supply of feedstock with a consistent calorific value, because all of that will massively affect the overall performance of the project, as I'm sure you are all very familiar. Yeah, it's there are numerous examples, and I don't want to sound like a neghead in terms of quoting only bad cases. There are some good cases, but it's basically tread carefully, take an holistic view, make sure it fits your client's long-term strategy. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this as well, haven't we? But as I said, quite often it is a question of invest, install, commission, and forget. And that's happened an awful lot. We carried out one BMS optimization program at a major university in the north of England, and by their own estimates, and I would like to get the actual figures behind it, if I'm honest, they think that their energy consumption was reduced by well in excess of 30% purely through the optimization of an existing system. So it's not a question of coming in and saying you need to rip that out and put this fantastic new system in, only to repeat the same error. I think that our approach is more about making existing systems work better by optimization rather than replacing systems. I don't know about you guys, but we're not out there to sell other people's kit. We're there to help the client manage his energy better and make what he's already got work better for him. Then these days. And as I said, MMT systems for me is always our starting place. So again, making sure that the system that's installed doesn't have holes in it in terms of the meters are one, working, and secondly, that you're actually metering the right things. You don't need to sub-meter everything. Just understand what's important. And my starting point is always, what are the deliverables from the system that the client wants? What is it that that client actually wants to know on a daily, monthly, weekly basis? And then ensure that his their MMT system is fit for purpose and actually does what it wants them to do. You don't necessarily need hundreds of sub-meters at all, but equally, you probably need something more than just fiscal income as well. So we would look at an existing system, identify where the issues were, and then look to optimize that system to make it work and deliver what the client actually needs. It's also important, of course, increasingly for GHG reporting and for things, compliance issues like ESOS and SCCR, CCA, etc. Contractual conflicts we've talked about. We've got an awful lot of experience. I'm not trying to do a sales pitch here. I'm just trying to make people aware of some of the issues. Is you can have really good plant that's been designed well, it's been installed well, but down the line you find that you're tied into a contract that isn't flexible, that doesn't take into account the changing needs of the business or of the site. And we've had numerous examples of that. One of which was for a pharmaceuticals manufacturer. They were 7 or 8 years into a 15-year contract, and they asked us to review it for them mid-term, which we did. And on one clause alone, contractually, the incumbent FM provider, one of their obligations was to provide steam at a given pressure 24/7, or to make it available 24/7. The reality of it was that a couple of years after that contract had been signed, the site no longer had need for that steam, but were continuing to pay for its availability because contractually it was there. That was costing them £150,000 a year on one clause, which no one had picked up. So we helped them renegotiate it and save them £1.2 million just on one clause. So hopefully that exemplifies how these things can be missed. So getting the contracts right in the first place, making them flexible, ensuring there's break clauses and a proper suite of KPIs within them is absolutely critical. And of course, ensuring that you're measuring and validating performance. Absolutely critical. Measurement and verification, well, we've obviously talked about this already or touched upon it, but it is critical for a number of reasons. For validation of the CapEx projects, sometimes it's involving millions of pounds. You need to be as sure as you can be that these things are going to work. They're also critical for non-technical projects. Behaviour change, according to the Committee for Climate Change, might account for 50% of potential GHG reduction, which is huge. And as you know, as part of ESTA, Jez Rutter has been particularly involved in the ENCO project, which is basically all about any behaviour change, collecting case studies, because that's one of the challenges around behaviour change. People think it's soft, it's non-tangible, there's no evidence. Well, there is lots of evidence out there, and growing evidence that an effective behaviour change programme is exactly that, very effective. We've got numerous examples ourselves where it's worked really well. But if you think about it, not just in the context of energy, but in the context of net zero as well, you can have all the automation you like, you can have all the reporting you like and all the data you like, but if nothing's done with it, if you don't have effective processes and policies and procedures in place, then nothing will in effect change. I've dealt with organisations that have even had ISO 50001 in place, but it's been driven by one person who has since left the business. And what ISO is supposed to do is help provide a legacy for the business that someone could just pick it up, follow the process, and it should still be managed in the same efficient way. However, that's not the reality of life. It's someone else's baby. They leave the company, and it doesn't continue. So measurement and verification is critical, because one thing's for sure, whilst historically it was when energy prices went up, suddenly the senior management team were interested in energy. Prior to that, they just weren't. It didn't mean anything to them. They weren't worried it was something that was free. We all know that. However, now net zero is very much in the boardroom. It's one of the priorities that, sorry, something just crashed in my kitchen. It's very much in the boardrooms, thanks to people like Mark Carney and an increased awareness amongst the public and all stakeholders for that matter. I mentioned earlier about finance sector choosing not to invest in non-sustainable organisations, and certainly not invest in fossil fuel companies anymore. And that has had a trickle-down effect. So that's very much messages being received loud and clear in boardrooms. And that's had a trickle-down effect as well, because increasingly major companies are asking their supply chains for their commitments and strategies around net zero, and will increasingly then be asking them for progress reports around how they're doing. And it will become a prerequisite to be in supply chains. So if you can't demonstrate that you are working towards a net zero strategy and making progress, then it may prevent you or prevent your clients from being in that supply chain. So it's a real threat to the future of any business and any organisation. And it's creeping in, or it's already becoming part of NHS and other government procurement. I'm sure that you've all witnessed it, increasingly being asked questions around net zero. So measurement and verification is absolutely critical in helping to demonstrate and evidence what you're doing. And I suppose the message to end on in terms of net zero, and I'm happy to talk about net zero and the net zero process and how you develop a strategy. But I think be careful not to create more white elephants, stroke stranded assets in the pursuit of your net zero goals. Really, our approach is have a net zero strategy, which longer term might be 20 years, 25 years. And that's fine, but recognize that unless you're prepared to spend millions and millions and millions, the technology on large isn't there to achieve net zero within a relatively short time frame. So our approach is to set the long-term strategy, which we would use the science-based target trajectory tool, which is a free-to-use tool, to set a trajectory for any given organisation. And then we go away and do a net zero gap analysis to understand where the organisation is currently across all scopes. And by all scopes, I'm talking about the broader scope 3. So I'm not just talking about the bit that they directly control and influence, like their own transport. I'm talking about scope 3, which includes their supply chain, which for all organisations, almost without exception, will account for the lion's share of their GHG impacts anyway. And it's often something you see organisations announcing that they are net carbon zero, which is confusing for people, because what they actually mean is, and it does smack a little bit of greenwashing if you don't get the message right and explain it. What they actually mean is that they will be net carbon within scopes 1 and scopes 2, i.e. their own direct operations, by a given date. And partly that's often done through some sort of offsetting or insetting as well for residual emissions. In some cases not. But what it does, it gives the impression that they've achieved net zero, which of course they haven't, because probably 80 to 90% of most organisations' GHG impacts come from within their supply chain. So unless you do the work and look at the supply chains and calculate what their emissions are, then basically it is a little bit of greenwashing for me, and it won't stand up to scrutiny. So what we do is, when we do the net zero gap analysis, yes, we look at scope 1, scope 2, we do energy environment audits, etc. We visit sites where necessary, but then we'll do an expenditure-based analysis of supply chains, where you'll find that the 80-20 rule generally applies. So in other words, 80% of the GHG emissions will come from 20% of suppliers, generally, as a rule of thumb. So very much that's what we do before then coming back and looking at, yep, here's your long-term strategy to achieve net zero in 20 years. However, here's an implementation plan that spans 5 years. And the reason for that is because it takes into account today's political landscape, today's legislation, and today's technology or emerging technology. But it doesn't look for those silver bullets and hang a hat on something that may never actually come to fruition. So it's really important that you're moving your clients one step at a time in 3 or 5 year windows towards their long-term goal of net zero. And within that, you might have our first 5 year implementation plan means that at the end of that, a milestone target will be to be net carbon within our own operations. And that's fine, and that's brilliant, and that's progress. Nothing wrong with that, but just be open and transparent about it. That's just one step in your journey towards net zero, which will take longer. I think that's me, actually.
Thanks, George. I'm just looking through there at the moment, obviously everyone's so stunned and impressed. There aren't any questions in the chat, but I've got a couple of things I want to just ask. No, don't worry. I mean, I think there obviously everyone has different views on things, and I think sometimes people listen, and rather than sort of coming out with lots of questions early on, I wanted to ask you a couple of things.
Sure.
I'm going to take the host's right to ask these questions, really. One was, I mean, are you finding that there's a lot of reluctance amongst businesses, this discussion about business and getting to net zero, how much is it actually going to affect the day-to-day business activity that businesses are engaged in? Are you finding some resistance to, I mean, you mentioned obviously that some of them have got potentially stranded assets, the white elephants. Is there quite a reluctance to change those to green in terms of, obviously, as you said, it's multiple white elephants, there's not any one. But are you finding if it really is likely to affect business operations, especially obviously bearing in mind the pandemic and obviously some challenges to business operations anyway, have you found much resistance, or are people trying to persuade you that they aren't really white? And can you sort of come between white and green, or, you know, green and white? Yeah,
no, I mean, look, we're practical, we're pragmatic. That's our whole approach. If an organisation's invested, you know, £10 million in a CHP plant 5 years ago, we're not going to say you should scrap that. What we'd say, it's a bit like the argument about EVs. We've had the debate internally because we've got our own net zero target. Our biggest impact is on travel. So, you know, the immediate knee-jerk reaction would be, right, we need to switch out to EVs straight away. But of course, then you've got to look at, well, what's the impact on, what's the GHG impact on producing a new EV vehicle, as opposed to continuing to run a petrol or fossil fuel car until the point it becomes inefficient or unreliable, and then purchase a new EV. And in actual fact, if you look at the numbers, it's better to actually wait to that point and then buy a new EV rather than jumping straight to it, which sounds counterintuitive, but you have to, you have to think about these things. So when you've got installed plant, no, we would say, take a considered view. There may be an operational need for on-site generation, in which case you can consider renewables as an example. But if you're midway through the life of a project, you can't afford to just write that off. So no, we would say run it, but run it as efficiently as you can. We can help to optimize systems anyway and make sure that they're running as best as they can, but then have within your, say, your second implementation plan to then look at and review that piece of kit or your on-site generation, and then start to consider alternatives. Because it doesn't always involve capital either. You can often get these things, we're all familiar with solar PPAs, for instance, EPCs, where you don't have to actually find the capital, and you pay back through guaranteeing taking the energy from that plant at a fixed rate for a given period of time. So there are various ways in which these things can be achieved. So no, we wouldn't just go in and go, actually, write that off, scrap all your cars, turn off your CHP engine. That's not what we're about.
We don't try and make the elephants white extinct. We try and convert them. Okay. Yeah. And in terms of information, because obviously, as you said, you've got several slides there, each with different views about the white elephants. Apart from employing a wonderful firm of consultants such as your own, are there any other places that businesses can start on their own, or at least make that first step, or ascertain some of where the white elephants might be and how they could tackle them on their own? Or do you think it's a job? Again, I suppose it depends on the nature of the business, how complicated the business is, how many different operations they're doing. It's not a one size fits all, is it?
No, it's very much not. I mean, we've recently made available our fact sheets on all sorts of different subjects here. In fact, one of which was the role of CHP in your net zero roadmap, interestingly enough. So there is some information out there, but I think, being perfectly frank about it, we're dealing with such a diverse range of clients now around net zero. All of them have different circumstances, different views, different drivers. Some of which saying we need it now. We don't know what we need. We don't even know what net zero is, but we need it because the board has said we need it.
Or someone's telling you that if you don't have it, you're not going to get onto
absolutely, absolutely, Mervyn.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right about the 5 million announcement, haven't you, recently, where the government said they won't be giving any, don't expect any contracts unless you're net zero. You've got a plan for net zero.
The problem is that there are also, as there's always been, I guess, people are jumping on the bandwagon with limited knowledge, shall we say, limited blend of knowledge and experience that enables people to go in and actually, it was a bit like ESOS, isn't it? ESOS phase one, you had all sorts of people suddenly going away doing a 2-day course and becoming experts. I had one in particular that used to ring me up, and I'm not as qualified as you guys, but I had him ringing me up almost daily asking for advice around ESOS. Should I do this? How should it? The guy had never even set foot in a factory, and yet he was going and doing audits of manufacturing businesses. And in the end, I said, I'm going to charge you a day rate if you ring me again for advice. As much as I like you, this is ridiculous. And it's the same with net zero. It really is. It's not just about data.
I think that's the other challenge for me, is that this whole concept, net zero, has become buzzword. It really has become the ultimate buzzword. But as you quite rightly said, there are different views on it. There are different thoughts about it. Businesses don't necessarily fully understand it, which is a bit frustrating, bearing in mind they're being encouraged to tick a box and sign up for something like Race to Net Zero for the COP event coming up. I can see major concerns where just thrusting all this stuff at businesses and saying, right, tick this box in itself isn't really going to necessarily solve.
It won't work anyway, because it won't be credible. It won't be credible. And equally, on the other side of the coin, there were some organisations, certainly at the beginning of this, back 2 years ago, were jumping up and signing up to the Science-Based Target Initiative, without realising how onerous it was, and without realising that the targets they were declaring, let's say 2040 in some cases, they had no idea how they were going to get there. They hadn't done their homework first. And so we advise our clients against signing up to the SBTI, at least initially. do your homework first, understand where you're at, understand what's achievable, because it is quite onerous. Because with the SBTI, if you sign up to targets within there, you will be audited within 2 years, and within 5 years, your suppliers have to be signed up to it as well. So it's pretty onerous. So yeah, tread carefully is what I'd say. But yeah, take a practical view of it. Don't think you can achieve net zero overnight and you'll be all right.
Despite what everyone else is telling you out there. I actually have got a question now. So welcome. Thanks, David. That just stops me having to keep prattling on. I'll ask one last question, which I'm asking all the events this week, but I'll just put the question to David. David's question here is efficiency improvement being overshadowed by zero carbon electricity?
I think some people look for a cure-all, don't they? What's that magic bullet? In the same way as we've had the question asked as well. If we understand what our emissions are, we can offset them all, can't we? And then we can declare ourselves net zero. And we go, no, you can't. And one, we won't help you to do it anyway. And that just shows you your level of ignorance, to be frank about it. That's what I'm thinking. It's not what I'm saying. But no, it's the same. It's the same thing as one, how renewable is that electricity? How long are you going to be able to get it and at what rate? And besides which, what about decarbonisation of heat, which primarily comes from gas or other fossil fuels? So it's definitely not any sort of magic bullet. And then when you look at your scope 3, you'll find a whole myriad of different suppliers, some of whom will already be doing really good stuff, and others who will need some help, and others who will probably never get there, particularly in the Far East. And it's at that point then you have to take a different view as to, well, we've tried, they're not forthcoming, they're not going to change, we need to look for alternative suppliers. So it starts to get you beyond just GHGs anyway, because when you look at supply chains, you start to uncover other issues around fragility of your supply chain and about other SDG issues like child labour, certain substances that are continuing to be used that people further up the supply chain don't even realise that they're in their supply chain. So it brings an awful lot more value than purely understanding what your GHG impacts are.
Oh, okay.
It really does. It's fascinating, to be honest.
And in depth, I mean, this sort of subject, we could have multiple events over a very long period of time. One last question, really, which, as I said, is just something I'm asking every one of the event people this week, is really, if you had a magic wand that said the government, we've got solutions, this is what business needs, what policy would you think help turn more of those white elephants green? Shall we put it that way? Which would it be tax? Oh no, there's actually someone else coming in as well. But if you want to just answer that one, and I'll just quickly do one more question that's come in from David, if you can answer that. Oh.
Sorry.
Well, let me ask. I'm going to ask James. James has asked a question here. Good afternoon, George. I'd be very interested to hear your views on how best logistics organisations would best achieve net zero with the majority of their emissions coming from the transport element of their business.
Well, they're direct emissions, yeah, definitely. So if you think about DHL or anyone like that, but and funny enough, we've had some involvement with the logistics companies. With transport, it really depends what they're currently doing. I mean, obviously, you can look at things like driver training, which is all about behaviour change. You can look at, well, we've got Euro 6 fleet vehicles now. At what point should we change to EVs? Is technology there? Is hydrogen going to have a role to play? And it really depends on the profile of the existing fleet, the needs of their clients moving forward. So, for instance, I was talking to, and I'm not going to say who it was, a well-known food brand, who, because of the policies that increasingly cities like Aberdeen, Birmingham, London have taken about clean air zones, can't run HGVs in cities for the distribution of their foodstuffs. So they're now thinking, not only do we have to, even though they've got Euro 6 now, they now are thinking, right, okay, so the next step has to be, we have to go for a different type of EZD delivery vehicles, but also we have to change how we distribute, not just from the transport perspective, but now, rather than having 2 or 3 major distribution centres in different parts of the country, we have to have smaller distribution centres on the outskirts of the major cities and deliver with EVs from there and use the best other alternative vehicle to deliver from the point of manufacture to those smaller distribution centres. So it has an impact all around it. It really does depend on the individual circumstances. I mean, we were asked to look at new depots on behalf of one of the major global logistics companies, and they wanted us to go and look at, or come up with an approach to look at 250 potential new sites in Europe and the UK, which is easy, but it only represented something like 1%. That whole estate only represented 1% of their GHG impact. And yes, transport was a major one in terms of their own direct emissions. But then on top of that, you have to consider everything that's supplied to them as well. Okay. Not what they're carrying, but what is supplied to them, including the vehicles themselves, but everything else too. So it can be quite complex, and it's never as simple as you think it is.
No.
Hopefully that's answered the question, sort of.
I think it, as best as you possibly can in this type of event. It's never, you can't really answer every single question completely. Yeah, so I'll just quickly go back to my one sort of overarching. Is there anything you think the government, if you had a magic wand and said the government, we need to do this to get more businesses over this net zero line, is there a policy that you would suggest might help? I mean, would it be some sort of incentivization, some sort of tax incentivization, or some sort of counteractive that to legislation where you're going to legislate and say you must do this, or do you think it's voluntary?
I think it's a number of measures, because as we know from our experience, if you think about all the years that we banged our heads against walls, beating the drum about energy management and why are you wasting all this energy? It's a cost to the business, and well, it's not a priority, and it's because energy wasn't expensive enough, basically. So some organisations will definitely be driven by how much is it going to cost us. So it's either cost avoidance or cost saving, or a combination of both. And stronger legislation. So if you think about ESTA as an example, we could do the same thing with net zero. 2050 still seems an awful long way off. And for Western businesses, they don't think strategically. In the East, they do. They think they have 50-year plans in Japan and China. Here, you're lucky if you can find a company with a 5-year plan.
Well, to be fair,
that's a real cultural change, isn't it?
Yeah, although I mean, in theory, of course, now we've got the 2035 more imminently, haven't we, on the 78% rather than the, I must admit, 2050 from any business perspective. I mean, still for me, as someone who's run businesses, owned businesses over many, many years, I struggle majorly with a business, even some of the major corporates, the larger businesses, having that, as you said, a 50 or 30-year plan is quite an ask.
There is, and even to start considering it, it's a bit of a manana. It's like so far away. So you have to, for me, you have to have shorter term goals. Yeah. I think there has to be a combination, as it always has been, of strong legislation and stick and carrot basis, strong legislation, but financial incentives, whether that's tax breaks or whether it's cost avoidance or a combination thereof. So if you take ESOS as a microcosm example, ESOS for me just completely lacked teeth. All it means is that people just basically every 4 years have to do the same as they did 4 years ago, and they don't have to do anything with it. If there was a mandatory obligation to implement those opportunities that were proven and demonstrable, then I think people would take it a lot more seriously and do more about it.
Which, of course, now potentially they are just consulting. I mean, a consultation has just come out, 2 weeks ago, 5th of July. And that's one of the factors in there that they are really, I think, now seriously considering mandatory ESOP recommendations. Because
it's a difficult one, though, isn't it, Mervyn? Because it depends on paybacks, GHG impacts, what do they take into account? And for some corporates, it'll be easy for them to do. For those that are cash strapped, not so easy. So it's a
balancing act, but then being in business is a balancing act at any one time. You've got so many different bits of legislation to keep going. So to be fair, net zero probably ranks in some of the other business challenges at the moment. I can see it wouldn't necessarily be at the top of everyone's list.
It's not, but it's interesting because we're dealing with a myriad of organisations of all shapes and sizes, and even some of the smaller borderline SME businesses are saying, well, we're being asked by our major clients or clients for this, and we know because the signs are there and that we've been told that we have to do it. We won't have a choice. So they're doing it.
Because they're the scope 3 for the major corporates.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're part of the supply chain.
Exactly.
George, I'm really grateful for your time today.
No
I've no other questions come through. People have probably got fed up with me asking questions.
or me talking.
This will be a good time. No, well, I think it's worth having a bit of a discussion. That's one of the reasons I'm trying to have this debate about government and what policies would help in each of the presentations we're having this week. So whether it's technical, whether it's behaviour, whether it's, you know, a slightly more general discussion, I think it's relevant because I think it's going to be a major, government policy's got to be a major part of everything. This isn't going to just happen from the private sector.
No, not at all. I think for anyone that's involved in net zero or helping clients to get there, I think it's really important to live and breathe it, which is something that we started to do 4 years ago. We were already living and breathing. You know what we're like, Mervyn, but I think you have to have that passion and that belief. We as a company and as individuals very much live and breathe what we do, and that comes across. You have to have that passion for the subject. You have to understand it, and you have to believe it. If you rock up in your client's car park in a 3.5 litre Range Rover, they're not going to take you very seriously.
Or if you arrive at a G7 event in a plane, that would be I'm not going to make any political points. That's nothing to do with politics.
No, I'm with you there anyway, man. Completely. Absolutely.
Anyway, so George, as I say, I'm so grateful for your time, and I'd like to thank everyone else who's taken the time to be with us today. Apologies again for the start. As I say, I don't want too many more situations where the laptop goes down on me 3 minutes before the event starts. Luckily, there was another one to hand, so at least I managed to get on eventually, so not all's lost. Just to let you know as well, this event is going to be available on demand on the Net Zero Week website once we've finished. So yeah, hopefully you'll be able to catch up on anything you've missed and some of those excellent information from George. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day, and
cheers. Bye all.
Hopefully see some of you on another ESTA event later in the week.
Cheers.
Bye now. Bye.